The Georgia sun hung mercilessly over the Whitmore plantation, its rays cutting through the humid air like invisible blades. In the distance, cotton fields stretched endlessly, dotted with bent figures moving rhythmically under the oppressive heat. But inside the grand white mansion, a different kind of suffering unfolded in the shadows of luxury. Chloe's bare feet moved silently across the polished wooden floors, her calloused hands gripping a heavy water pitcher. At 19, she had spent the last 6 years of her life within these walls, her world reduced to the narrow corridors between the kitchen and the master bedroom. Her dark skin bore the marks of countless punishments. Thin scars on her arms, a permanent bruise on her left shoulder where Mistress Whitmore's cane had struck her just days before. "Chloe! Where is that worthless girl?" The shrill voice of Eleanor Whitmore echoed through the house like the crack of a whip. "My bathwater should have been ready an hour ago." The young woman quickened her pace, water sloshing dangerously close to the pitcher's rim. She had learned long ago that hesitation only brought more pain. The mistress's voice carried the particular edge it always held when she was preparing for one of her social gatherings, a tone that promised suffering for anyone who dared to disappoint her. Eleanor Whitmore sat at her vanity, her pale fingers drumming impatiently against the mahogany surface. Her reflection stared back from the ornate mirror, framed by golden curls that had been carefully arranged by another slave girl earlier that morning. At 35, she was still considered beautiful by the standards of Georgian high society, but her beauty was cold and sharp, like polished marble. "There you are, you lazy creature," Eleanor snapped without turning around. "Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting? Mrs. Pemberton will be here within the hour, and I refuse to receive her looking anything less than perfect." Chloe kept her eyes downcast, a survival mechanism she had perfected over the years. "I'm sorry, mistress. The fire took longer to heat the water properly." "Excuses," Eleanor hissed, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "Always excuses with your kind. Perhaps you need another reminder of what happens when you fail in your duties." The mistress's hand moved to the silver-handled riding crop that always rested on her dressing table. Chloe's body tensed involuntarily, muscle memory preparing for the familiar sting of leather against skin. But today, something felt different. A strange calm had settled over her, as if she were watching the scene unfold from outside her own body. "Prepare my bath," Eleanor commanded, her voice dripping with disdain. "And this time, make sure the water is the perfect temperature. Too cold, and you'll spend the night in the cellar. Too hot, and you'll wish you had." As Chloe moved toward the adjoining bathing chamber, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mistress's mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Gone was the frightened girl who had first entered this house. In her place stood someone harder, someone who had been pushed to the very edge of human endurance. The bathing chamber was a testament to the Whitmore family's wealth. A large copper tub dominated the center of the room, surrounded by imported tiles that depicted scenes of Roman luxury. Towels made from the finest cotton picked by hands like Chloe's, hung from golden hooks on the walls. Chloe began the familiar ritual of preparing the bath, her movements automatic after years of repetition. She tested the water temperature with her wrist, adjusting the mixture of hot and cold until it reached the precise warmth that Eleanor demanded. But as she worked, her mind wandered to places it had never dared venture before. She thought of her mother, sold away when Chloe was 13. She thought of her younger brother, who had tried to run away and been caught by the overseer's dogs. She thought of the countless nights she had fallen asleep to the sound of her own tears, wondering if this was all life would ever offer her. "Chloe," Eleanor's voice cut through her reverie like a blade. "What is taking so long?" "Almost ready, mistress," Chloe called back, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her chest. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her silk bathing gown. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the afternoon light, filtering through the chamber's single window. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never known want, never known fear, never known what it meant to be treated as less than human. "Finally," Eleanor muttered, testing the water with her fingertips. "At least you managed to get something right today." As the mistress disrobed and stepped into the tub, Chloe stood nearby with fresh towels and soap, playing her role in this daily theater of servitude. But something had shifted in the air, a tension that neither woman fully understood yet. Eleanor settled into the warm water with a sigh of satisfaction, her eyes closing as she allowed herself to relax. For a moment, the harsh lines of her face softened, revealing traces of the young woman she had once been before years of privilege had hardened her heart. "The water is perfect today," Eleanor admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps you're finally learning your place." Chloe said nothing, but her grip tightened on the empty water pitcher she still held. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of the plantation, the overseer's shouts, the crack of whips, the mournful songs of her people as they worked under the merciless sun. All of it seemed to be building toward this moment, this single point in time where everything would change. The mistress began to hum softly, a melody Chloe recognized from the parlor gatherings where she served wine to Eleanor's friends. It was a song about love and loss, about dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. The irony was not lost on the young slave woman, who had never been allowed to dream of anything beyond survival. As the afternoon light shifted through the window, casting long shadows across the bathing chamber, Chloe felt something crystallize inside her chest. It was not quite courage, not quite desperation, but something altogether more dangerous. The absolute certainty that she could no longer live as she had been living. The water in Eleanor's bath began to cool, and soon it would be time to add more hot water from the kitchen. It was a routine Chloe had performed hundreds of times before, but today, she knew with startling clarity, would be different. Today, everything would change. The kitchen of the Whitmore plantation buzzed with the controlled chaos of preparation. 3 other house slaves moved efficiently around the large room, their movements choreographed by years of shared labor. The massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden surfaces where countless meals had been prepared for the master's family. Chloe stood before the fire, watching the large iron kettle as steam began to rise from its surface. The water inside was reaching the perfect temperature for the mistress's second rinse, hot enough to cleanse, but not so hot as to cause discomfort. At least, that had always been the intention. "You best hurry with that water," whispered Sarah, an older woman whose grey hair was hidden beneath a faded head wrap. "Mistress Eleanor been asking for you twice already." Sarah had been at the plantation longer than anyone, arriving as a young woman nearly 30 years ago. She had seen slaves come and go, had witnessed punishments that would haunt her dreams forever, and had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation life with careful words and downcast eyes. "I know," Chloe replied, her voice distant. She continued to stare into the kettle, watching the bubbles form and rise to the surface. The water was almost ready, perhaps too ready. "Child, what's gotten into you today?" Sarah moved closer, her weathered face creased with concern. "You been acting strange since this morning, like you ain't quite here with us." Chloe finally turned to look at the older woman, and Sarah took an involuntary step backward. There was something in the young woman's eyes that she had never seen before, a hardness that spoke of decisions made and bridges burned. "I'm tired, Sarah," Chloe said simply. "Tired of being afraid, tired of being hurt, tired of pretending that this is living." "Hush now." Sarah glanced nervously toward the door. "You can't be talking like that. Not here, not ever." But Chloe wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering the morning 3 days ago when Eleanor had struck her across the face for dropping a hairpin. She was remembering the night 2 weeks ago when she had been forced to sleep on the kitchen floor because the mistress claimed her bed linens weren't properly pressed. She was remembering 6 years of accumulated humiliations, each one a small death of the spirit. The water in the kettle had reached a rolling boil, steam rising in thick clouds that seemed to mirror the storm building in Chloe's chest. She reached for the heavy ladle, her movements deliberate and calm. "Chloe," Sarah's voice carried a note of warning. "That water's too hot for bathing. You need to let it cool some." "I know exactly how hot it is," Chloe replied, lifting the kettle from its hook with steady hands. In the bathing chamber, Eleanor Whitmore was growing impatient. The water in her tub had cooled to an uncomfortable temperature, and she could hear the distant sounds of her guests arriving for the afternoon social gathering. Mrs. Pemberton's carriage had already pulled up the circular drive, followed by 2 other carriages carrying the wives of neighboring plantation owners. "Chloe," Eleanor's voice echoed through the house with increasing irritation. "Bring that water immediately." Eleanor stood up in the tub, water cascading from her pale form as she reached for a towel. The afternoon light streaming through the window caught the droplets on her skin, creating an almost ethereal effect. For a moment, she looked vulnerable, human even, a woman preparing to receive friends, concerned about appearances and social standing. But the moment passed quickly as her impatience reasserted itself. She had a reputation to maintain, a position in society that required constant vigilance. The wives of other plantation owners would be watching her every move, looking for any sign of weakness or impropriety. A mistress who couldn't properly manage her household slaves was a mistress who couldn't be trusted with more important matters. The sound of footsteps on the wooden floor announced Chloe's approach. Eleanor settled back into the cooling water, preparing to deliver another lecture about punctuality and proper service. She had already decided that Chloe would receive 10 lashes after the guests departed, a reminder that tardiness would not be tolerated. "There you are," Eleanor said without looking up. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten your duties entirely." Chloe entered the bathing chamber carrying the kettle of boiling water, her face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within her. She moved with the same quiet grace that had characterized her service for 6 years, giving no indication that anything had changed. "I apologize for the delay, mistress," Chloe said, her voice steady. "The water took longer to heat than expected." Eleanor waved dismissively, her attention already turning to the sounds of conversation drifting up from the parlor below. "Just add it to the tub quickly. I need to dress and receive my guests." This was the moment Chloe had been moving toward all day, perhaps all her life. She stood at the edge of the copper tub, the kettle heavy in her hands, steam rising between them like incense at an altar. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity as she made her final choice. Eleanor closed her eyes and leaned back in the tub, presenting the perfect target. Her face was serene, unguarded, completely trusting in the established order that had always protected her. She had no reason to fear the young woman who had served her so faithfully for so many years. "The water feels cooler than usual," Eleanor murmured. "Make sure you add enough to warm it properly." Chloe lifted the kettle higher, her muscles tensing for what was to come. In her mind, she could see her mother's face on the day she was sold away, could hear her brother's screams as the overseer's whip found its mark, could feel every blow she had ever received at Eleanor's hands. "Yes, mistress," Chloe whispered. "I'll make sure it's exactly the right temperature." The afternoon sun chose that moment to break through a cloud, flooding the bathing chamber with golden light. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny spirits, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird began to sing. It was a beautiful day in Georgia, the kind of day that made visitors comment on the natural splendor of the South. But beauty and horror often walked hand in hand in this place, and today would be no exception. Chloe took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in 6 years, She was about to make a choice that was entirely her own. The consequences would be terrible, she knew, but the act itself would be hers alone. The kettle tilted forward, and Eleanor Whitmore's world changed forever. The scream that erupted from Eleanor Whitmore's throat was unlike anything that had ever been heard in the grand house. It was primal, animalistic, a sound that spoke of agony beyond human comprehension. The boiling water had found its mark with devastating precision, cascading over Eleanor's face and shoulders as she instinctively tried to shield herself. Chloe stood frozen, the empty kettle still clutched in her hands, watching as the woman who had tormented her for 6 years writhed in the copper tub. Steam rose from Eleanor's scalded flesh, and the water around her turned pink with blood from where her skin had begun to blister and peel. "My eyes!" Eleanor shrieked, her hands clawing at her face. "I can't see! I can't see!" The sound of running footsteps echoed through the house as servants and family members rushed toward the source of the terrible screaming. Chloe remained motionless, her mind strangely calm, despite the chaos erupting around her. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and the knowledge brought her an unexpected sense of peace. Master James Whitmore burst into the bathing chamber first, his face flushed from running up the stairs. At 42, he was a man accustomed to control, to having his world operate according to his will. The sight that greeted him, his wife thrashing in bloody water while his house slave stood nearby with an empty kettle, shattered that control completely. "What in God's name happened here?" he roared, rushing to Eleanor's side. Eleanor's face was a horror to behold. The boiling water had done its work with ruthless efficiency, leaving her skin red and blistered, her eyes swollen shut and weeping. She reached blindly for her husband, her fingers leaving bloody streaks on his shirt as she clutched at him desperately. "She did it!" Eleanor gasped between sobs. "The slave girl! She threw boiling water on me! I can't see, James! I can't see anything!" James Whitmore's gaze snapped to Chloe, who still hadn't moved from her position beside the tub. His face contorted with rage and disbelief as the full implications of what had occurred began to sink in. A slave had attacked his wife, not just attacked, but maimed her, possibly permanently. "You!" he snarled, pointing a trembling finger at Chloe. "What have you done?" More people crowded into the chamber now. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale with horror as she took in the scene. Behind her came 2 of Eleanor's guests, Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Crawford, their afternoon social gathering forgotten in the face of this unprecedented violence. "Dear Lord," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. "Is she—" "Get the doctor," James commanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Send someone to fetch Dr. Morrison immediately." But even as he spoke, he knew that no doctor could undo what had been done. The damage to Eleanor's eyes was severe, possibly irreversible. The woman who had prided herself on her beauty, who had used her appearance as a weapon against those she considered beneath her, would never look the same again. Chloe finally spoke, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I did what needed to be done." The simple statement sent shockwaves through the room. Slaves were expected to be contrite when caught in wrongdoing, to beg for mercy and promise never to transgress again. They were not supposed to stand calmly and claim ownership of their actions. "You admit it?" James's voice was barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "I admit it," Chloe replied, meeting his gaze directly for the first time in 6 years. "She has tortured me every day since I came to this house. She has beaten me, starved me, humiliated me, and treated me like an animal. Today, I chose to fight back." Mrs. Crawford gasped audibly, her fan fluttering nervously in front of her face. In all her years as a plantation owner's wife, she had never heard a slave speak with such defiance, such complete lack of fear. "You chose," James's voice rose to a roar. "You chose. You are property girl. You don't get to choose anything." Eleanor's sobs had quieted to whimpers as shock began to set in. Blood continued to seep from her damaged eyes, staining the towel that Sarah had gently placed over her face. The proud, imperious woman who had ruled this household with an iron fist was reduced to a broken, blind creature clinging to her husband for support. "Fetch the overseer," James commanded one of the male servants who had gathered in the hallway, "and send word to the sheriff. This creature will pay for what she's done." But Chloe seemed untouched by the threats swirling around her. She set the kettle down carefully on a nearby table, her movements deliberate and unhurried. When she spoke again, her voice carried across the room with startling clarity. "I know what's coming," she said. "I know you'll kill me for this, but for the first time in 6 years, I feel like a human being instead of a thing you own." Sarah stepped forward, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Chloe, child, what have you done? What have you done to yourself?" "I've set myself free," Chloe replied simply. "Maybe not in the way you mean, but free all the same." The sound of horses' hooves on the gravel drive announced the arrival of Dr. Morrison, a thin, nervous man who served the medical needs of the plantation families in the area. He pushed through the crowd of onlookers, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. "Let me through," he said, kneeling beside the tub where Eleanor still lay. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you hear me?" Eleanor's response was a barely audible whisper. "I can't see, Doctor. The pain, it's unbearable." "Doctor..." Morrison examined her injuries with practiced efficiency, his face growing increasingly grave as he assessed the damage. The boiling water had done exactly what Chloe had intended. It had destroyed Eleanor's sight, possibly permanently, and left her face scarred beyond recognition. "We need to get her to bed immediately," the doctor said. "The burns are severe, and there's significant damage to the eyes. I'll do what I can, but..." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone in the room understood. Eleanor Whitmore, the beautiful, cruel mistress of the plantation, would never be the same again. As servants carefully lifted Eleanor from the tub and carried her to her bedroom, James Whitmore turned his full attention to Chloe. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You will suffer for this," he promised, his voice low and deadly. "You will suffer in ways you cannot imagine." Chloe nodded calmly. "I expect I will, but she suffered me for 6 years, and I survived that. I can survive whatever you do to me." The overseer arrived then, a brutal man named Garrett, who had earned his position through his willingness to inflict pain without question. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood what had transpired. "Want me to take her to the punishment shed?" he asked James. "Not yet," James replied, his eyes never leaving Chloe's face. "First, I want every slave on this plantation to see what happens to those who forget their place. Gather them in the main yard, all of them." As word spread throughout the plantation, field hands began to abandon their work and make their way toward the main house. They came slowly, reluctantly, knowing that whatever had happened would result in a display of violence designed to remind them of their powerlessness. Chloe was led outside, her hands bound behind her back, to face whatever judgment awaited her. But as she walked through the house where she had spent 6 years in servitude, she felt something she had never experienced before, the satisfaction of having struck back at her oppressor. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plantation grounds. Soon, the entire community would witness the consequences of her actions. But for now, in these final moments of relative peace, Chloe allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be human. The main yard of the Whitmore plantation had never seen such a gathering. Nearly 200 slaves stood in the oppressive afternoon heat, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and barely concealed dread. Word had spread quickly through the quarters about what Chloe had done, and now they all waited to witness the inevitable consequences. Master James Whitmore stood on the raised porch of the main house, his face still flushed with rage and disbelief. Beside him, Overseer Garrett methodically uncoiled a bullwhip, the leather strips gleaming ominously in the fading sunlight. The message was clear. This would not be a simple punishment, but a spectacle designed to crush any thoughts of rebellion before they could take root. Chloe was forced to her knees in the center of the yard, her hands still bound behind her back. The rope cut into her wrists, but she felt no pain. A strange numbness had settled over her, as if her spirit had already begun to separate from her body in preparation for what was to come. "Look at her." James's voice carried across the silent crowd. "Look at this creature who dared to raise her hand against her betters." The assembled slaves kept their eyes downcast, but Chloe could feel their attention focused on her like a physical weight. Some of them had known her since she was a child, had watched her grow from a frightened girl into the woman who now knelt in the dirt, awaiting her fate. "For 6 years my wife showed this slave kindness," James continued, his voice rising with each word. "She was given work in the house, spared the hardships of the fields, treated with more consideration than her kind deserves. And how was this generosity repaid?" A murmur ran through the crowd at the word kindness. Every slave on the plantation knew the truth about Eleanor Whitmore's treatment of the house servants, but none dared to voice their thoughts aloud. "With treachery," James roared, "with violence, with an attack so vicious, so unprovoked, that my dear wife may never see again." Dr. Morrison emerged from the house at that moment, his face grim as he approached James. The two men spoke in hushed tones, but their body language told the story clearly enough. Eleanor's condition was grave, possibly permanent. "The doctor confirms what we already knew," James announced to the crowd. "This slave has blinded my wife. She has destroyed the sight of a Christian woman, a lady of refinement and grace." Old Samuel, a field hand who had been on the plantation for over 40 years, shifted uncomfortably in the crowd. He remembered Eleanor as a young bride, remembered the gradual hardening of her heart as the years passed. Grace was not a word he would have used to describe her, but he kept his thoughts to himself. "The law is clear about such crimes," James continued. "A slave who attacks their master or mistress forfeits their life, but death would be too merciful for this one. She will suffer as my wife suffers. She will know pain as my wife knows pain." Garrett stepped forward, the whip coiled in his hands like a sleeping serpent. He was a man who took pride in his work, who had perfected the art of inflicting maximum pain without causing immediate death. Today, he would have the opportunity to demonstrate his skills before the largest audience he had ever commanded. "But first," James said, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone, "I want to hear from this slave herself. I want her to explain to all of you why she chose to throw away her life for a moment of violence." All eyes turned to Chloe, who slowly raised her head to meet James's gaze. Her face was calm, almost serene, showing none of the fear that the crowd expected to see. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the silent yard. "I chose to be human," she said simply. "For 6 years, your wife treated me like an animal. She beat me, starved me, humiliated me in ways that would shame the devil himself. Today I reminded her that I am not an animal. I am a person with feelings and dignity and the right to defend myself." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. No one had ever heard a slave speak such words, claim such rights. It was dangerous talk, the kind that could spread like wildfire if not immediately and brutally suppressed. "Rights?" James laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You have no rights, girl. You are property, bought and paid for. You exist solely to serve your betters, and when you fail in that service, you are punished." "Then punish me," Chloe replied, her voice steady. "But know that when you do, you're punishing someone who chose to fight back rather than accept cruelty. You're punishing someone who remembered what it means to be human." Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Crawford watched from the safety of the house's upper windows, their faces pale with shock. They had come for an afternoon of polite conversation and gossip, but instead found themselves witnesses to something unprecedented, a slave who refused to show proper contrition, who spoke of rights and dignity as if such concepts applied to her kind. "She's completely mad," Mrs. Crawford whispered. "The heat must have affected her mind." But Mrs. Pemberton was not so sure. There was something in the young woman's demeanor that spoke not of madness, but of a terrible clarity. She had made her choice with full knowledge of the consequences, and she was prepared to face whatever came next. James nodded to Garrett, who began to unfurl the whip with practiced ease. The leather strips fell to the ground with a soft whisper, and several of the younger slaves in the crowd began to weep quietly. They all knew what was coming, had witnessed such scenes before, but never with a victim who faced her fate with such composure. 50 lashes, James announced. "And then we'll see if this slave still speaks of rights and dignity." But before Garrett could raise his arm for the first blow, a commotion erupted near the edge of the crowd. A rider was approaching at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. As he drew closer, James recognized him as Tom Bradley, a neighboring plantation owner who served as the local magistrate. "James!" Bradley called out as he reined in his horse. "I came as soon as I heard." "Is it true? Has one of your slaves attacked Eleanor?" "See for yourself," James replied grimly, gesturing toward Chloe. "She admits to the crime freely, claims she had the right to defend herself." Bradley dismounted and approached Chloe, studying her face with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to judging human property. What he saw there clearly disturbed him, not the broken spirit of a slave caught in wrongdoing, but the calm resolve of someone who had made peace with their fate. "This is a serious matter, James," Bradley said quietly. "An attack on a master's family. It could inspire others. We need to handle this carefully." "I intend to make an example of her," James replied. 50 lashes, then we'll see what other punishments might be appropriate." But Bradley shook his head. "No, my friend. This goes beyond plantation justice. A crime this serious requires the full weight of the law. She must be tried properly in court, where her punishment can serve as a lesson to every slave in the county." The crowd stirred uneasily at this news. A trial meant delay, meant uncertainty. It also meant that Chloe's fate would be decided not just by her master's anger, but by the cold machinery of Southern justice. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the plantation yard, the assembled slaves began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not just the punishment of a single rebellious slave, but a moment that would echo through their community for years to come. Chloe remained on her knees in the center of it all, her face turned toward the darkening sky, waiting to see what form her final act of defiance would ultimately take. The courthouse in Savannah was the imposing structure of red brick and white columns, designed to project the authority and permanence of Southern law. On this sweltering morning in late July, it drew an unprecedented crowd. Word of the slave who had blinded her mistress had spread throughout Georgia like wildfire, and people had traveled from neighboring counties to witness what many considered the trial of the century. Chloe sat in the defendant's area, her wrists shackled to a heavy iron chain around her waist. 3 weeks in the county jail had taken their toll. Her face was gaunt, her clothes little more than rags, but her eyes still held that same unsettling calm that had disturbed so many witnesses to her crime. Judge Cornelius Blackwood presided over the proceedings, his white hair and stern demeanor lending gravity to the courtroom. At 68, he had overseen hundreds of cases involving slave crimes, but never one quite like this. The defendant's refusal to show proper remorse, combined with the severity of her crime, had created a legal spectacle that threatened to expose uncomfortable truths about the peculiar institution of slavery. The state of Georgia versus the slave known as Chloe. the clerk announced. "The defendant stands accused of assault with intent to maim, destruction of property, and inciting rebellion among the slave population." Prosecutor William Ashford rose from his table, his black robes rustling in the humid air. He was an ambitious young man who saw this case as an opportunity to make his reputation by defending the sacred order of Southern society. "Your Honor," Ashford began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "we are here today to address a crime so heinous, so unprecedented in its brutality, that it strikes at the very foundation of our way of life." In the gallery, Eleanor Whitmore sat beside her husband, her face hidden behind a black veil. The burns had healed poorly, leaving her skin scarred and puckered. Her eyes, once her greatest vanity, were now milky white and sightless. She had not spoken publicly since the attack, but her presence in the courtroom served as a powerful reminder of the consequences of Chloe's actions. "The defendant," Ashford continued, gesturing toward Chloe, "was shown kindness and consideration far beyond what her station warranted. She was given work in the house, spared the hardships of field labor, and treated with a gentleness that her kind rarely experiences. How did she repay this Christian charity with an act of violence so calculated, so vicious, that it has left a refined lady permanently disfigured and blind?" Several members of the jury nodded in agreement. They were all white men, property owners who understood the delicate balance required to maintain order in a slave-holding society. The idea that a slave might attack her betters without provocation was deeply disturbing to their sense of natural order. "But this case is about more than one slave's ingratitude," Ashford pressed on. "It is about the message we send to every slave in Georgia. Will we allow them to believe that violence against their masters is acceptable? Will we permit them to think that they possess rights equal to those of white Christians?" The prosecutor's words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone in the courtroom understood the implications. This trial was not really about Chloe's guilt, which was never in question, but about reaffirming the absolute authority of white masters over their human property. When it came time for Chloe's defense, the court-appointed attorney, a nervous young man named Robert Mills, rose reluctantly to his feet. He had been given this case against his will, and his discomfort was evident in every gesture. "Your Honor," Mills began hesitantly, "while we cannot dispute the facts of this case, we must consider the circumstances that led to this tragic event. The defendant has lived her entire life in bondage, subject to the absolute authority of her masters. Perhaps the pressures of such a life contributed to a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Mills was essentially arguing for mercy based on temporary insanity, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He understood, as did everyone present, that his role was largely ceremonial, a legal formality required to give the proceedings an appearance of fairness. Judge Blackwood called for a brief recess, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. In the gallery, plantation owners discussed the implications of the case for their own properties, while their wives whispered about the horror of Eleanor's disfigurement. But it was outside the courthouse that the most significant conversations were taking place. In the slave quarters of Savannah, in the fields of surrounding plantations, and in the hidden gathering places where enslaved people shared news and hope, Chloe's story was being told and retold. "She looked that white woman in the eye and told her she was human," whispered an old field hand to his grandson. "First time I ever heard one of us claim such a thing in front of the masters." "What good did it do her?" the younger man replied bitterly. "She'll hang for it and nothing will change." "Maybe," the old man said thoughtfully, "but maybe something already has changed. Maybe just saying those words out loud was enough to plant a seed." Back in the courtroom, Judge Blackwood had returned to his bench. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors where so many fates had been decided. "Will the defendant rise for sentencing?" the judge commanded. Chloe stood slowly, her chains clanking softly in the sudden silence. She faced the judge directly, her posture straight despite the weight of her shackles. "Chloe!" Judge Blackwood began, his voice heavy with the authority of law and tradition. "You have been found guilty of assault with intent to maim, destruction of property, and inciting rebellion. These are serious crimes that strike at the very heart of our social order." The judge paused, studying the young woman before him. In all his years on the bench, he had never encountered a defendant quite like her. Most slaves, when faced with the full weight of white justice, broke down completely, begging for mercy, promising reform, appealing to Christian charity. But this one stood before him with a dignity that was deeply unsettling. "Before I pronounce sentence," the judge continued, "the court will allow you to speak on your own behalf. Do you have anything to say?" A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. It was unusual for a slave to be given such an opportunity, but the unprecedented nature of the case seemed to call for unprecedented procedures. Chloe was silent for a long moment, her gaze moving slowly across the faces in the courtroom. The jury members who had already decided her fate, the spectators who had come to witness her destruction, the lawyers who had played their assigned roles in this theater of justice. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the packed room. "Your Honor," she began, "I stand before you today not as a repentant slave begging for mercy, but as a human being who chose to defend her dignity against cruelty. For 6 years I endured treatment that would break the spirit of any creature with a soul. I was beaten, starved, humiliated, and treated as less than an animal." The courtroom was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on her words. This was not the speech they had expected to hear. "You say I destroyed property," Chloe continued, her voice growing stronger. "But I was property too, wasn't I? And what happens to property that fights back against its owner? What happens when property remembers that it was once human?" Judge Blackwood's face had grown increasingly stern as Chloe spoke. This was exactly the kind of dangerous rhetoric that the trial was meant to suppress. Yet here it was, being spoken in his own courtroom. "I know you will kill me for what I did," Chloe said, her voice now carrying a note of something that might have been peace. "But I want everyone in this room to remember that when you do, you will be killing someone who chose to be human rather than property, someone who chose dignity over survival." The silence that followed her words was deafening. In the gallery, Eleanor Whitmore sat motionless behind her veil, while her husband's face had turned an alarming shade of red. The jury members looked uncomfortable, as if they had heard something they were not meant to hear. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, his voice harsh when he finally spoke. "The defendant's words only confirm the wisdom of this court's decision. Such defiance, such complete lack of proper submission cannot be tolerated in a civilized society." He raised his gavel, the symbol of legal authority that would seal Chloe's fate. But before he could speak the words that would condemn her, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. The doors had burst open, and a man in travel-stained clothes was pushing his way through the crowd, shouting something that was lost in the general confusion. As he drew closer to the front of the courtroom, his words became clear. "Stop the proceedings," he called out. "I bring word from the governor." The man who had burst into the courtroom was Thomas Hartwell, a courier from the governor's office in Milledgeville. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he approached Judge Blackwood's bench with an official document clutched in his hand. "Your Honor," Hartwell gasped, still catching his breath, "I bear an urgent communication from Governor Lumpkin regarding this case." Judge Blackwood's face darkened with annoyance. Political interference in judicial proceedings was always unwelcome, but particularly so in a case as sensitive as this one. He gestured impatiently for the courier to approach. "What possible interest could the governor have in the sentencing of a slave?" Blackwood demanded as he broke the official seal on the document. The courtroom buzzed with speculation as the judge read the governor's message, his expression growing increasingly troubled with each line. Finally, he looked up, his face a mask of barely controlled frustration. "It appears," Judge Blackwood announced reluctantly, "that this case has attracted attention beyond our local jurisdiction. The governor has received communications from various parties expressing concern about the precedent that might be set by this trial." Prosecutor Ashford rose from his seat, confusion evident on his face. "Your Honor, surely the governor does not intend to interfere with the administration of justice." "The governor," Blackwood replied stiffly, "has requested that sentencing be delayed pending a review of the case by the State Attorney General. He is particularly concerned about the inflammatory nature of the defendant's statements and their potential impact on slave populations throughout the state." A murmur of disbelief swept through the courtroom. In the gallery, James Whitmore shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "That creature blinded my wife. She admitted her guilt. What more review is needed?" But Judge Blackwood was already gathering his papers, clearly eager to escape the political complications that had suddenly engulfed his courtroom. "The court is adjourned pending further instruction from the state capitol. The defendant will be remanded to custody until such time as these proceedings can be resumed." As the gavel fell, chaos erupted throughout the courtroom. Spectators who had come expecting to witness a swift execution found themselves instead witnessing something unprecedented. A slave whose case had become too politically sensitive for immediate resolution. Chloe was led away in chains, but not before her eyes met those of several people in the gallery. There was something in her gaze that would haunt them for years to come. Not the broken spirit of a defeated slave, but the unquenchable fire of someone who had chosen to be human, regardless of the cost. In the weeks that followed, Chloe's story spread far beyond the borders of Georgia. Abolitionists in the North seized upon her case as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality, while Southern newspapers struggled to explain how a simple case of slave discipline had become a political embarrassment. The delay in sentencing created an unexpected opportunity for reflection, and in slave quarters throughout the South, people began to whisper about the woman who had dared to claim her humanity in a court of law. Her words were repeated in hushed tones, passed from plantation to plantation like seeds carried on the wind. "She said she chose to be human rather than property," an old woman told her granddaughter as they worked in the cotton fields. "First time I ever heard one of us say such a thing out loud." "What good did it do her?" the girl replied. "She's still in chains, still waiting to die." "Maybe," the old woman said thoughtfully, "but maybe that ain't the point. Maybe the point is that she said it at all." Meanwhile, in the Savannah jail where Chloe awaited her fate, she had become something of a legend among the other prisoners. Guards reported that she spent her days in quiet contemplation, showing none of the despair or madness that typically afflicted condemned slaves. "She's not natural," one guard confided to another. "Most of them break down after a few days, start begging and crying. But this one, it's like she's at peace with whatever's coming." Dr. Morrison, who had been called to treat Eleanor's injuries, found himself haunted by the case in ways he couldn't fully explain. He had seen the results of slave violence before, usually desperate, clumsy attempts at escape that ended in swift and brutal punishment. But Chloe's attack had been different, calculated and precise, carried out with a cold determination that spoke of careful planning rather than momentary rage. "She knew exactly what she was doing," he confided to his wife over dinner one evening. "The water was at precisely the right temperature to cause maximum damage without killing immediately. It was surgical in its precision." "Don't speak of such things," his wife replied sharply. "It's not proper to discuss the methods of slave violence." "But Dr. Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something significant, something that would be remembered long after the political furor had died down. In his medical practice, he had seen countless examples of human suffering, but rarely had he encountered someone who faced their fate with such complete acceptance of the consequences. As autumn arrived in Georgia, bringing relief from the oppressive summer heat, word finally came from the state capital. The Attorney General had completed his review, and the case would be returned to Judge Blackwood's court for final resolution. The second trial was a much quieter affair. The political sensitivity of the case had discouraged many of the spectators who had packed the courtroom during the initial proceedings. Eleanor Whitmore was notably absent, her husband explaining that her condition had deteriorated and she was no longer able to travel. Judge Blackwood wasted no time in bringing the proceedings to their inevitable conclusion. "The defendant will rise for sentencing," he commanded, his voice betraying his eagerness to be done with this troublesome case. Chloe stood as she had before, her chains clanking softly in the hushed courtroom. The months in jail had taken their toll. She was thinner now, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame, but her eyes still held that same unsettling calm. "Chloe," Judge Blackwood began, "you have been found guilty of assault with intent to maim, destruction of property, and inciting rebellion. The court sentences you to death by hanging, said sentence to be carried out at dawn on the 15th day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1830. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Chloe received her death sentence with the same composure she had shown throughout the proceedings, nodding slightly as if the judge had simply confirmed something she had always known. But as she was led away for the final time, something unexpected happened. From the gallery a voice called out, not in celebration of justice served, but in something that sounded almost like a farewell. "God bless you, child." The voice belonged to an elderly white woman, a plantation owner's widow who had sat through both trials in silent observation. Her words caused a stir in the courtroom, and Judge Blackwood's gavel fell repeatedly as he called for order. But the damage was done. In those three simple words, spoken by a member of the very class that Chloe had supposedly wronged, lay an acknowledgement that would echo through the years to come. An acknowledgement that perhaps, in some fundamental way, Chloe had been right to claim her humanity. As news of the sentence spread throughout Georgia and beyond, the story of the slave who had chosen dignity over survival began to take on a life of its own. In the slave quarters, her name was spoken with a mixture of awe and sorrow. In the parlors of the great houses, it was whispered with unease and growing concern. The execution was set for dawn, but Chloe's true legacy was only beginning to unfold. The morning of November 15th, 1730, dawned grey and cold over Savannah. A thin mist rose from the Savannah River, shrouding the city in an ethereal veil that seemed fitting for what was to come. By the time the sun had fully risen, a crowd had gathered in the town square where the gallows stood like a dark monument to Southern justice. Chloe was brought from her cell in the pre-dawn darkness, her chains removed for the final time. She wore a simple white dress that had been provided by the jail's chaplain, a gesture of mercy that was meant to allow her to meet her maker with some semblance of dignity. Her hair had been braided and covered with a white cloth, and despite the months of imprisonment, she walked with steady steps toward her fate. The crowd that had assembled was smaller than expected, but more diverse than anyone had anticipated. Alongside the usual spectators who attended public executions were faces that surprised the authorities. Free blacks who had somehow learned of the execution, poor whites who seemed to view Chloe as something other than a common criminal, and even a few well-dressed individuals whose presence suggested that her story had reached into unexpected corners of society. Sheriff William Tompkins read the charges and sentence in a voice that carried little enthusiasm for the task. He had overseen dozens of executions during his tenure, but none had felt quite like this one. There was something in the air, a tension that spoke of historical significance rather than routine justice. "Chloe, a slave belonging to James Whitmore of Chatham County," he announced, "you have been found guilty of assault with intent to maim, destruction of property, and inciting rebellion. You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging until dead. Do you have any final words?" The crowd fell silent, waiting to hear what the condemned woman might say in her final moments. Many expected a plea for mercy, a confession of wrongdoing, or perhaps a religious testimony about salvation and forgiveness. What they heard instead would be remembered and repeated for generations to come. Chloe stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite the early morning chill. "I stand here today not as a repentant slave, but as a human being who chose to defend her dignity. I do not ask for your forgiveness, because I have done nothing that requires forgiveness. I defended myself against cruelty, and I would do so again." A murmur ran through the crowd at these words. Even in her final moments, she refused to play the role that society expected of her. "To my people," she continued, her gaze moving across the faces in the crowd, "I say this: remember that you are human beings, not property. Remember that you have souls, that you have dignity, that you have the right to defend yourselves against those who would treat you as less than human." Sheriff Tompkins shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing that the condemned woman would simply accept her fate quietly. But Chloe was not finished. "And to those who own my people," she said, her voice carrying a note of prophecy, "I say this: the day will come when you will answer for your cruelty. The day will come when the chains you have forged will be broken and my people will be free." These words sent a chill through the crowd that had nothing to do with the morning air. In the antebellum South, such talk was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. Yet here was a woman about to die, speaking of freedom and justice as if they were inevitable rather than impossible. The chaplain, Reverend Marcus Webb, stepped forward to offer final prayers. He was a kind man who had spent many hours with Chloe during her final weeks, trying to bring her to what he considered proper repentance, but she had remained steadfast in her conviction that she had done nothing wrong. "Lord," he prayed, his voice trembling slightly, "we commend this soul to your mercy. Grant her peace in the world to come, and grant us wisdom to understand your divine plan." As the noose was placed around her neck, Chloe closed her eyes and seemed to find a place of perfect calm within herself. The executioner, a man named Samuel Cross, who had performed this duty for over a decade, later said that he had never seen anyone face death with such complete composure. "Any last words?" Sheriff Tompkins asked, following the prescribed ritual. Chloe opened her eyes one final time, her gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the morning air. "I die as I lived in these final months, as a human being who chose dignity over survival. Remember me not as a slave who forgot her place, but as a woman who remembered her humanity." The trapdoor opened with a sharp crack that echoed across the square like a gunshot. Chloe's body dropped through the opening, and the rope went taut with a sound that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. But even in death, she maintained the dignity that had defined her final months. Her face remained peaceful, as if she had simply chosen to sleep. The crowd dispersed slowly, many walking away in silence, rather than with the usual chatter that followed public executions. Something had changed in that moment. Something that couldn't be easily defined or dismissed. The woman they had come to see die as a criminal had instead died as something else entirely. A martyr, perhaps, or a prophet, or simply a human being who had refused to accept that her humanity was negotiable. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen throughout Georgia and beyond. Slaves who had never shown signs of rebellion began to speak more boldly to their masters. House servants who had always kept their eyes downcast began to meet their owners' gazes directly. Field hands who had worked in sullen silence began to sing songs that spoke of freedom and justice rather than resignation and sorrow. James Whitmore, meanwhile, found his world crumbling around him. Eleanor's condition had indeed deteriorated following the trial, and she now spent her days in a darkened room, refusing to see visitors or participate in the social activities that had once defined her existence. The scars on her face had healed badly, leaving her appearance so altered that even her closest friends struggled to recognize her. But it was not just Eleanor's physical condition that troubled James. The plantation itself seemed to have been infected by some invisible malaise. Slaves who had once worked efficiently now moved with deliberate slowness. Tools went missing with suspicious frequency. Crops that should have thrived instead withered in the fields, as if the very earth had turned against him. "It's that girl's doing," Eleanor whispered to him one evening as he sat beside her bed. "Even dead, she's still poisoning everything she touches." James wanted to dismiss his wife's words as the ravings of a damaged mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. Chloe's execution had been meant to restore order, to remind everyone of their proper place in the social hierarchy. Instead, it seemed to have accomplished the opposite. Dr. Morrison, who continued to treat Eleanor's injuries, found himself thinking often about the case. In his medical practice, he had seen the effects of violence countless times, but never had he encountered someone who had wielded it with such precision and purpose. Chloe's attack had been surgical in its execution, designed not just to cause pain, but to send a message. She knew exactly what she was doing, he confided to his journal one evening. Every aspect of her actions was calculated to achieve maximum impact. The choice of weapon, the timing, the location, all of it was planned with the care of a military strategist. But it was in the slave quarters throughout the South that Chloe's true legacy began to unfold. Her story spread from plantation to plantation, carried by the invisible network of communication that connected enslaved communities across vast distances. With each telling, the story grew and evolved, taking on mythic proportions that transcended the simple facts of what had occurred. "She looked that white woman in the eye and told her she was human," an old field hand told his grandson as they worked in the tobacco fields of Virginia. "First time any of us ever claimed such a thing in front of the masters." "What good did it do her?" the boy asked. "She still died for it." "Maybe," the old man replied thoughtfully. "But maybe dying ain't the worst thing that can happen to a person. Maybe living without dignity is worse." In Charleston, a house servant named Mary began to speak more boldly to her mistress, no longer accepting verbal abuse without response. When questioned about her changed behavior, she simply said, "I remembered that I'm human too." In Mississippi, a field hand named Joshua refused to work on Sundays, claiming that even slaves deserved a day of rest. When threatened with punishment, he stood his ground, saying, "A woman in Georgia died for her dignity. I reckon I can risk a whipping for mine." These individual acts of defiance might have been dismissed as isolated incidents, but taken together, they represented something unprecedented. An awakening of consciousness among enslaved people that their humanity was not dependent on their master's recognition of it. The authorities, meanwhile, struggled to understand what had gone wrong. Chloe's execution had been carried out according to law and custom, yet instead of serving as a deterrent, it seemed to have inspired exactly the kind of behavior it was meant to prevent. "It's her words," Sheriff Tompkins confided to Judge Blackwood over drinks one evening. "The things she said before she died, they're being repeated in every slave quarter from here to Virginia. We should have gagged her," but Judge Blackwood shook his head. "It wouldn't have mattered. The damage was done the moment she refused to show proper contrition, the moment she claimed to be human rather than property." As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Chloe's story continued to spread and evolve. Abolitionists in the North seized upon it as evidence of slavery's inherent brutality, while Southern newspapers struggled to explain how a simple case of slave discipline had become a rallying cry for resistance. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave who had become a powerful voice for abolition, wrote about Chloe's case in his newspaper, The North Star. In choosing dignity over survival, this brave woman reminded us all that the human spirit cannot be permanently enslaved. Her death was not a defeat, but a victory of the soul over the chains that bind the body. But perhaps the most significant impact of Chloe's story was felt in the quiet moments of daily life throughout the South. In the slave quarters, where her name was spoken in hushed tones, in the fields where her words were remembered and repeated, in the hearts of people who had been told their entire lives that they were less than human. A young slave woman in Alabama, facing her own moment of crisis when her master attempted to assault her, found the courage to fight back because she remembered Chloe's words about choosing dignity over survival. A field hand in North Carolina refused to accept a brutal punishment he didn't deserve, standing tall and meeting his overseer's gaze directly because he remembered that he was human too. These moments of resistance, small and large, began to accumulate like drops of water that would eventually become a flood. The institution of slavery, which had seemed so permanent and unshakable, began to show hairline cracks that would eventually widen into the fissures that would bring it down. Years later, when the Civil War finally came and the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, historians would trace the roots of that great transformation back through decades of growing resistance and awakening consciousness. And in the slave quarters turned free communities, old people would tell their grandchildren about a woman named Chloe, who had chosen to be human rather than property, and whose courage had helped light the way to freedom. Eleanor Whitmore lived for another 15 years after the attack, but she never recovered her sight or her former beauty. She became a recluse, rarely leaving her darkened room, haunted by nightmares of boiling water and the calm voice of the woman who had destroyed her world. When she finally died in 1745, her last words were reportedly about Chloe, though what exactly she said was never recorded. James Whitmore's plantation never recovered from the events of 1730. Productivity declined year after year as his slaves became increasingly difficult to manage. He sold the property in 1740 and moved to Charleston, where he lived quietly until his death in 1752. Local legend claimed that he was haunted by Chloe's ghost, though more likely he was haunted by the knowledge that his world was changing in ways he could neither understand nor control. The house where Chloe had lived and worked was eventually abandoned, but it became a place of pilgrimage for enslaved people who could manage to visit it. They would stand in the room where she had made her fateful choice, drawing strength from the knowledge that someone like them had once stood in that same place and chosen dignity over survival. And in the end, that was Chloe's true legacy, not the violence of her final act, but the courage of her final choice. She had reminded an entire people that their humanity was not dependent on their master's recognition of it, that dignity was something that could be claimed rather than granted, and that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance was simply refusing to accept that you were less than human. Her story became a thread in the larger tapestry of resistance that would eventually unravel the institution of slavery itself. And though her name might not appear in the history books alongside the more famous heroes of the abolitionist movement, her spirit lived on in every act of defiance, every moment of courage, every choice to be human rather than property. In the slave quarters of the antebellum South, they would say that Chloe's ghost still walked the plantations, whispering to those who had forgotten their worth, reminding them that they were human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Whether or not such a ghost truly existed, her memory certainly did, a memory that helped sustain hope in the darkest of times and courage in the most desperate of moments. And perhaps that was the most fitting monument to her life and death. Not a statue or a plaque, but the living memory of a woman who had chosen to be human when the world told her she was property, and whose choice had helped light the way for countless others to follow.